In 2003, a record label executive sat across a desk from a young man from Burnaby, British Columbia, and told him with the patient tone of someone delivering obvious information to someone too stubborn to receive it, that the music he wanted to make was finished, that nobody under the age of 60 wanted to hear big band arrangements and Frank Sinatra standards, that the world had moved on and the only sensible thing was to move with it. The young man listened carefully, and then he went and made the album anyway. That album sold millions of copies. So did the next one, and the one after that, and the Christmas record that would eventually become one of the best-selling albums of its decade in any genre, playing in kitchens and living rooms and department stores across the world every December, with the reliability of the season itself. The executive who delivered that assessment is not a household name. Michael Bublé is. But the story of how that happened is not a simple story of triumph over adversity. It is something more complicated and more interesting. It is the story of a man who made a choice that should not have worked, who held that choice against sustained professional pressure and personal doubt, and who discovered in the process something about music and identity and what it actually means to be right about something before the world is ready to agree with you. That story begins not in a record label office, but in a living room in Burnaby, where a boy was learning a language the world had almost forgotten. Mitch Santaga was a plumber. He worked with his hands, kept his savings carefully, and loved Frank Sinatra with the uncomplicated devotion of a man who had found in that music a precise articulation of things he had felt his entire life, but never had words for on his own. He played his records in the evenings, Sinatra, Tony Bennett, Nat King Cole, and his grandson Michael sat and listened with a quality of attention that was unusual in a child. Not polite attention, absorbed attention. The attention of someone who has found the thing they were made for and is drinking it in before they have the vocabulary to name what it is. Michael Bublé was born in 1975 in Burnaby, the second of three children in a working-class household where music was present but not professionally serious. His father Louis played guitar, his mother Amber sang around the house. Neither pushed music as a career. The family understood, in the practical way of families without generational wealth to cushion risk, that careers required reliability, and music was not reliably a career. But what Mitch Santaga gave his grandson in those evening listening sessions was not a career plan, it was a language. The language of the American standards, the vocabulary of longing and joy and romantic loss, expressed through the architecture of the great American songbook, performed by singers who understood that a song was not a vehicle for demonstrating vocal ability, but a container for emotional truth. You did not show the audience how well you could sing. You showed them something true about being human, and the singing was simply the means by which you showed it. Michael absorbed this at an age when the things you absorb become the foundation of everything else. By 13, he was singing those songs not as imitation, but as expression, not doing Sinatra, but using the language Sinatra had taught him to say things that were specifically his own. By 16, he was performing publicly in the small ways available to teenagers in mid-sized Canadian cities, school events, local competitions, community gatherings where the audience was indulgent if not attentive. He was good. Everyone who heard him knew he was good. The question nobody could answer yet, the question that would define the next 15 years of his life, was whether being good at something the world had stopped wanting was the same as being good at nothing at all. The 1990s were, by almost any commercial measure, the worst possible decade in which to decide that your artistic identity was rooted in big band swing and the standards tradition. The decade belonged to grunge, to hip-hop, to the rise of electronic production, to boy bands engineered with demographic precision for maximum radio penetration. It belonged, above all, to youth, to the idea that culture moved forward by breaking with what came before, and that anyone who looked backward for inspiration was either nostalgic in the pejorative sense or simply confused about which direction history was moving. Michael Bublé was neither nostalgic nor confused. He was in a way the industry would take years to understand, simply ahead of something that had not yet arrived. But in the 1990s, that distinction was invisible. What was visible was a young man who wanted to sing songs his potential audience's grandparents had loved, in a style that radio programmers had mentally archived alongside 8-track tapes and rotary phones. He performed wherever he could find stages. Wedding receptions were the primary economy of his early career. Events where the audience had not come to see him, where success meant not being noticed in the wrong way, where the measure of a good night was that the dancing continued and nobody complained to the organizer. He played corporate events, holiday parties, local clubs that tolerated live music as background rather than foreground. He sang for rooms that were not listening, and he found a way night after night to sing as if they were. This is not a small thing. There is a particular kind of psychological erosion that comes from sustained invisibility, from showing up completely, fully prepared, genuinely committed, and watching your full preparation pass through a room without leaving a trace. Most people, confronted with this experience repeatedly, make one of two adjustments. They lower their ambitions to match what the world seems prepared to offer, or they stop entirely. Michael made neither adjustment. He kept showing up. He kept singing the songs he believed in for rooms that largely did not care, and he found within that discipline something that would later become audible in every performance he gave, a quality of presence built not on audience response but on internal conviction. The question that sustained him through those years was one he could not have answered directly if asked, what does it mean to know something is right before anyone else agrees? And what do you do with that knowledge when the cost of holding it keeps rising and the validation keeps not arriving? The music industry of the late 1990s and early 2000s was not cruel to Michael Bublé. Cruelty would have required engagement. What the industry offered instead was indifference, the particular indifference of institutions not equipped to process what does not fit their existing categories. A young man who wanted to make big band swing records simply did not compute as a viable commercial proposition in an era of teenage pop acts and rap rock crossovers. He submitted demos, he sought meetings, he worked the connections available to someone without industry relationships, which in practice meant working very hard for very little access. The responses he received, when he received any at all, followed a consistent pattern: genuine acknowledgement of vocal ability followed by polite explanation of commercial reality. You sing beautifully. Nobody is buying this. Come back when you have something current. Current. The word that kept appearing across different conversations in different rooms, the implication was always the same. What you are doing belongs to the past, and the past is not where the money is. Modernize. Adapt. Find a way to take whatever is genuinely good about your voice and put it in service of something the market is currently interested in. That is how careers are built. Michael understood the deal clearly, and he declined it anyway. This was not a dramatic refusal. No confrontation, no manifesto, no public declaration of principle. It was simply the quiet, persistent decision to keep doing the thing he believed in rather than exchange it for the thing the industry was prepared to support. Quiet persistence is less cinematic than dramatic refusal, but it is considerably harder to sustain. Drama is energizing. Quiet persistence, maintained year after year in the absence of external validation, requires something that looks from the outside very much like stubbornness and feels from the inside very much like faith. The faith was not blind. Michael knew with a precision that went beyond hope that what he was doing was genuinely good. The question was never whether the music was worth making. The question was whether the world would ever come around to agreeing and whether he could hold on long enough to find out. Mitch Santaga watched his grandson navigate these years with the particular combination of patience and urgency that belongs to grandparents who understand what they are seeing and know that the window for it is not unlimited. He saw the talent clearly, had seen it from those early evening listening sessions when a small boy had gone absolutely still at the sound of Sinatra. He had watched that stillness transform into something active and deliberate over the years, had watched Michael refine himself through hundreds of performances in rooms that did not appreciate what they were hearing. Mitch was not a wealthy man. He was a plumber who had worked honestly for decades and saved carefully, not for luxury, but for the specific purpose of having something to offer when something needed to be done. He had watched Michael spend years trying to find a way through the industry's indifference, and he had arrived at a conclusion that was simple and completely characteristic of who he was. The problem was not the music. The problem was that nobody with the power to change things had heard it properly yet. And that was a problem he could do something about. He paid for studio time, real studio time, and a proper facility with engineers who understood what they were working with and equipment that could capture a voice with the fidelity it deserved. Michael went into that studio and recorded the songs he had been singing for years, the standards, the swing, the music his grandfather had first introduced in a Burnaby living room. The result was a demo tape that finally captured the full reality of what Michael Bublé sounded like when the conditions were worthy of the voice. The demo changed hands through the informal networks that exist in every industry, connections leading to connections, until it reached someone with both the ears and the authority to act on what those ears told him. David Foster had produced some of the most successful records of the previous 3 decades. He had heard thousands of voices. When he pressed play on the Bublé demo, he heard something beyond technical ability, a quality of presence, of emotional intelligence, of understanding what a song actually needed, not performing, understanding. He picked up the phone, and that call was the moment everything changed. David Foster was not making a sentimental decision. His reputation had been built on commercial instinct as much as artistic judgment, on the ability to hear not only what a voice could do, but what a voice could sell, to whom, and at what scale. When he decided to work with Michael Bublé, he was making a considered bet on the proposition that there was an audience for this music that the industry had failed to identify because it had stopped looking. The bet was that the absence of swing and standards from mainstream popular music was not a permanent cultural condition but a temporary one, that the audience which had once made Sinatra commercially dominant had not disappeared. It had aged, fragmented, and been abandoned by an industry that had moved on to more obviously lucrative demographics. And that there was also a potential new audience, people in their 20s and 30s who had grown up without this music and might respond to it with the particular intensity of encountering something that felt both completely new and somehow deeply familiar. Michael Bublé's self-titled debut album was released in February 2003. It contained exactly what the industry had been telling him for a decade that nobody wanted, and it found, immediately and unmistakably, an audience that wanted it very much indeed. The album reached the top 5 in Canada. It charted in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia. The response was not the slow build of a cult following. It was immediate, broad, and slightly bewildering to everyone who had spent years explaining why this could not work. The executive who had told Michael that nobody wanted this music was not wrong about the industry, he was wrong about the audience. And the distance between those two things, between what the industry believed was wanted and what people actually wanted, turned out to be where Michael Bublé's entire career lived. The success of the debut was attributed, in the months following its release, to various factors: the Foster Association, the marketing, the timing, the novelty. These explanations were not wrong, but they were insufficient. They did not account for the quality of the response, not just the number of people who bought the album, but the intensity of the connection. The sense, reported repeatedly by people encountering the music for the first time, that they had been waiting for exactly this without knowing they were waiting. What Michael had understood, and what the industry had failed to understand, was that the emotional function the standards tradition performed had not become less necessary because the musical style had fallen out of fashion. People still fell in love. People still lost love. They still experienced the specific quality of happiness that exists in the presence of beauty and the ache that exists in its absence. They still needed music that could name those things precisely. What the contemporary market had largely stopped providing was music that named those things with the directness and emotional intelligence the standards tradition had always managed. There was a gap, and Michael Bublé walked into that gap. He also brought something to the tradition that the tradition had not always had: contemporary relevance without contemporary compromise. He was not a period piece performing nostalgia for people who wished they had lived in a different era. He was a young man in the present moment, singing songs that happened to have been written decades earlier, and the combination of his energy with the emotional weight of the material created something that felt neither retro nor modern, but simply true, permanent in the way that genuine emotional accuracy is permanent, across styles, across eras, across the changing fashions of what the industry decides people want to hear. The industry had told him the music was finished. What they had not considered was the possibility that some music is not subject to being finished, that some emotional territory is so fundamental to human experience that it will always need a voice capable of navigating it. Michael Bublé was that voice, and he had been that voice for a decade before anyone in a position to act on it agreed. Success, when it arrives after a long absence, has a different quality from success that comes quickly. It is heavier and more specific because it has been anticipated for so long that when it finally materializes, it carries the weight of all the years that preceded it. Every sold-out venue is heard against the memory of the venues that were not sold out. Every chart position is felt against the memory of the demos that came back unanswered. The applause is real, but it is always heard at some level against the background of the silence that preceded it for so long. Michael Bublé's career after the debut built with a consistency that was itself a kind of argument, not just commercially but artistically. Each album demonstrated that the first had not been a novelty or a lucky alignment of timing and circumstance, but the beginning of something with genuine depth and range. Crazy Love in 2009 reached number one in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia simultaneously, an achievement that most artists with decades long careers never manage. Christmas in 2011 became a cultural institution in the space of a single season, embedded into how millions of people experienced a specific time of year in a way that most music never achieves. Through all of it, Michael maintained an artistic consistency that was also a form of loyalty to the tradition his grandfather had introduced him to the emotional territory he had always believed music was capable of illuminating, and to the audience that had found him when the industry was still explaining why they would not. He did not chase trends. He did not modernize in the ways he had been repeatedly advised to modernize. He deepened, which is a different thing entirely and considerably rarer among artists who achieve commercial success at scale. Michael Bublé's career considered whole is an argument made not through words but through accumulated evidence, through the simple cumulative fact of work that endures, that reaches people across demographics and generations, that continues finding new audiences decades after it first appeared. The argument is about what music is actually for. The industry's case in the late 1990s was that music is primarily for the present, for the demographic currently being targeted, the trend currently being surfed. Music that was not of the present was not relevant, and irrelevance was the terminal condition. Michael's counterargument, made through years of performing and recording and refusing to compromise, was that music is primarily for the permanent, for the emotions that do not change with trends, the human experiences that have the same shape in every era. Music that could speak to those things precisely would always find an audience, because the audience for being human is inexhaustible. He was right. The evidence is the career itself, not just its commercial dimensions, but its emotional reach. The people who have sat in his arenas and felt something they were not entirely prepared to feel. The people who heard his voice through a kitchen speaker on a December afternoon and experienced, briefly and intensely, the grace of being reminded that beauty is still possible. The people who heard a love song interpreted with enough emotional intelligence to make the love in the song feel real rather than performed, and who recognized in that feeling something true about their own lives. Mich Santaga, the plumber who played Sinatra records in a Burnaby living room and paid for his grandson's first real studio session from his own savings, did not live to see the full extent of what he had helped set in motion. But he lived long enough to see the beginning, to sit in audiences and hear rooms of strangers respond to a voice he had recognized decades earlier, when it was a small boy sitting absolutely still on his living room floor, listening with his whole attention to music that the world had not yet told him he was supposed to love. The executive across that desk in 2003 was wrong about one thing. The music was not finished. It had simply been waiting in a grandfather's record collection, in a boy's absolute attention, in a decade of performances in rooms that weren't listening, for the voice that could carry it forward. That voice arrived from Burnaby, British Columbia, in the form of a young man who had been told repeatedly and with professional authority that nobody wanted what he had. Millions of people disagreed. They disagreed in the way that matters most, not with arguments, but with their presence, their attention, their willingness to sit in a room and feel something real. They disagreed with the particular eloquence of an audience that has found exactly what it was waiting for and recognizes it the moment it begins. The voice nobody wanted turned out to be the voice everyone needed. It just took the world a little time to catch up to what one old man in Burnaby had always already known.